They sold my lake cabin for a party I wasn't even invited to. My daughter and her husband used my home to celebrate his mother on a yacht, while I was left with nothing but silence. I sat in my car that night, staring at the place I once called mine. I could have screamed, but instead, I chose something else. What happens when the one they erased decides not to disappear? I still remember the way the light hit the lake that morning. Calm, undisturbed, like it had no idea what was about to come. I stood on the porch of the cabin my husband and I bought 50 years ago. It wasn't big, it wasn't fancy, but every nail, every beam, held something of us. We patched that roof ourselves the summer he got diagnosed. And even now, 5 years after I buried him, I could still hear his footsteps creaking along that hallway. I had just finished my coffee when the mail came, a thin envelope from the utilities office. Nothing strange. I opened it and saw a late notice for the water bill. But that made no sense. I paid it on time, always had. I even double-checked the amount just last week. So I called, gave them my name. The woman on the line went quiet for a second too long. Then she said, "Ma'am, you're not listed on this account anymore." I sat down, heart ticking uneven. Not listed. On my own house. She said the property had been transferred to new owners last month. At first I thought maybe it was a mistake, a mix-up in the records. But then I checked the deed, pulled it up online, and there it was. Sold. Paid in full. The buyer was a business name I didn't recognize. I don't remember hanging up the phone. I just remember staring at the lake like it could explain something. Like maybe it had seen the whole thing. That night, I called my daughter Desiree. She picked up like everything was fine. She asked if I had gotten the pictures from her latest trip to Miami. I told her I needed to talk. Serious. Urgent. Her voice dipped, but only a little. She said, "Mum, maybe we should sit down next week and go over everything together." I knew then. I knew before she even admitted it. Her husband, Mitchell, owns a luxury charter company. I had heard something about a yacht party they were planning for his mother's 80th. Champagne, live band, white linen dinner on open waters, the kind of thing people film with drones and hashtags. The cost? A little over $170,000. And they used the cabin. My cabin. My only home. Sold it to fund that celebration. For someone else's mother. I didn't scream. I didn't slam the phone. I just sat there with the air heavy around me. Some part of me still wanted to believe it was a one-time thing, a moment of desperation. But deep down, I think I had seen this coming. Small signs over the years, a shift in tone, a skipped holiday, a cold silence where warmth used to be. Still, I had never imagined they'd take everything, not like this. I know some of you listening right now might think I should have fought back right away, that I should have called the police or a lawyer or gone to the news. But when someone strips you of more than just a house, when they quietly erase the life you built, your first instinct isn't rage, it's stillness. I stayed in that stillness for a few days, and then I did something else. But that's a story for the next chapter. The following morning, I drove to the county clerk's office. I didn't call ahead. I didn't make an appointment. I walked in with a copy of the water bill and the name of the business that had bought the cabin. The clerk, a quiet man with grey temples and a nervous smile, pulled up the transaction without much delay. The cabin had been sold for $420,000, paid in cash. The name on the seller line was not mine, it was a trust my late husband and I had created decades ago, with both our names on it. But after his passing, Desiree became the secondary trustee. I remembered the meeting with the lawyer. She had offered to help manage the paperwork, back when I was still grieving and just trying to survive the loneliness. I had signed papers I barely read, trusted her the way mothers do. She had moved the cabin into the trust. Then she had moved the trust into her control. All legal, all neat. My name was still attached but held no power. I walked back to my car and sat there with the windows rolled down, the air sticky against my skin. My chest was tight, but I wasn't crying. It felt like something had shifted, like a door had quietly closed behind me. That afternoon, I drove past Mitchell's company building. I hadn't been there since the opening party years ago. He had rented a warehouse space in a gentrified block near the marina, polished concrete and oversized glass doors. Through the windows, I could see a banner still hanging. It read, Sylvia's 80th Yacht Soiree. It was only then I understood the full picture. Sylvia, Mitchell's mother, the woman who once told me I was too frumpy to sit at the head table at Desiree's wedding, the woman who referred to me in front of others as the cabin lady. And now they threw her a birthday party with money that came from the place I had scrubbed floors, fixed pipes, baked pies for my grandchildren in. I didn't go inside. I didn't make a scene. I just drove back home. Or what was left of home. I lived in a small apartment now, a rental above a nail salon, facing a parking lot. It had one bedroom and a kitchen so small I could touch the stove and the fridge without turning around. The walls were thin. At night, I could hear the woman in the unit next to mine coughing in her sleep. That night, I took out the box of old family photos I had managed to save. There was one picture of Desiree, maybe 10 years old, standing on the cabin dock, grinning with a fishing pole. Her father had his hand on her shoulder. I stared at that photo for a long time, longer than I care to admit. Memories don't rot like wood or fade like wallpaper. They stay. But when you realize those memories mean more to you than to the people in them, something inside you starts to break. I sat up until the sky turned pale. I didn't sleep, just sat still and let the weight settle. By morning, I knew I had to see someone. Not Desiree, not Mitchell. I needed clarity. So I made an appointment with Ms. Lovelace, my old estate attorney, the one I should have called years ago. I didn't tell her much over the phone, just that something wasn't sitting right and I needed to go over some old documents. She agreed to meet that afternoon. I didn't expect answers. Not yet. But I was done being confused. Done being quiet. If Desiree had turned my grief into a transaction, I needed to understand exactly what she'd sold, and what, if anything, I still had left. Miss Lovelace's office still smelled like lemon oil and old paper. Nothing had changed. The same mahogany bookshelves, the same ceramic lamp with the dusty green shade. She welcomed me with a soft nod and poured tea like she used to when my husband and I first sat in that room, nervous about estate planning but determined to do it right. I handed her a copy of the deed transfer and the trust documentation I had dug up. She took her time reading through them. Her brow creased deeper with every page. She didn't speak for a while, flipping back and forth between the signatures and dates. Then she placed the papers down and leaned back slightly. She said the structure looked legitimate on the surface. The trust was originally set up to hold and protect the cabin as a long-term family asset. After my husband passed, Desiree had used the successor trustee clause to reposition the trust. It gave her authority over decisions related to the property, especially if I was deemed to no longer be an active trustee. She paused. Then she showed me the form that triggered that clause. It was a letter, supposedly written by me, saying I was stepping down from all property-related responsibility for personal health reasons. The signature was mine, but I never remembered writing it, never remembered signing it. I stared at it for a long time. My hands went cold. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud, just a slow unraveling from the inside out. She asked if I wanted to challenge the validity of the document, but proving I hadn't signed something years ago without clear evidence was nearly impossible, especially when it wasn't outright forgery, but more likely something I had signed unknowingly, folded into a stack of estate updates, masked under legal terms I hadn't questioned. Ms. Lovelace sighed and explained my position clearly. The sale had been legal, but ethically, it had been built on manipulation. Trust, the emotional kind, had been weaponized. I thanked her, holding the folder tighter than I needed to. When I walked out into the hallway, the building felt colder than I remembered. Back at the apartment, I didn't turn on the lights. I just sat on the edge of the bed and let the silence fill the room. A part of me kept replaying the image of that signature, my own name used against me. Not by a stranger, by my child. That night, I opened the old tin box where I kept some of the family's early letters and keepsakes. Tucked beneath yellowed birthday cards and faded postcards was a small bundle of printed photos from Mitchell and Desiree's wedding. One image caught my eye. It was a photo of all of us standing together in front of the old lake cabin. Mitchell with his arm around Desiree. Sylvia, smiling just enough for the camera. And me, holding a tray of lemonade, standing a little to the side. I stared hard at the photo. And then I noticed something. Someone had cut out my face in another copy of the same photo. The original was intact, but tucked behind it, another version, cropped, trimmed, my outline replaced with a smoothed background. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't an accident. It was erasure. That image stayed with me longer than I expected, longer than the lawyer's words, longer than the signature, because it said what no one else had said out loud. I was no longer part of the story they wanted to tell. That was the moment I stopped mourning the cabin. I started thinking about legacy and what it meant to leave behind something real, not just wood and nails, but truth. They had erased me from one picture. I still had time to write myself into another. By the end of that week, I had made up my mind. I wasn't going to confront Desiree or Mitchell, not yet. Confrontation only feeds the fire, and I was no longer interested in giving them more of my energy. What I needed now was distance, not drama. I started sorting through old boxes I hadn't opened in years. Not the emotional kind with photos or memories, but the ones with paperwork, tax records, mortgage stubs, receipts from the first repairs we ever made to the cabin. I needed to remind myself who I used to be. Not someone forgotten or brushed aside, but someone who built things from scratch. Someone who paid her dues. Buried in one of the folders was a document I hadn't seen in a long time. It was from a community development board. Years ago, I had donated part of the land behind the cabin to the township to preserve it as a walking trail. I had forgotten about it. But as I reread the letter from the county, I realized it still held my name. Not the trust's. Mine. It gave me an idea. I reached out to an old contact, Marcy, who now worked at a local non-profit that focused on environmental education. She remembered me, said she still thought of the cabin as one of the most peaceful places she'd ever visited. I didn't tell her what happened, just said I wanted to talk about possibly creating a legacy project, a fund or program that could use what was left of the land or its memory for something meaningful. She was thrilled, said she'd speak to the board, that maybe, even if I no longer owned the property, we could create a community story project, one that used the space as inspiration, a way to teach local kids about heritage and respect for history. I hadn't expected that spark of hope, but it came. Small, quiet, like the first flicker of light before sunrise. Still, Even as I explored those new paths, something else stayed with me. The image of that altered photo, the slow realization that it wasn't just about the cabin, it was about who I had become in my daughter's eyes. Disposable, optional, like an old piece of furniture you quietly replace when no one is looking. That night, I took out my old journal and flipped to a blank page. I didn't write poetry or anything dramatic, just a list, a plain, quiet list of what I still had. My name, my hands, my story. The things no one could transfer or edit or crop out. It felt good to write it, to see it there in ink. It wasn't about revenge, it was about clarity, about recentering myself after being pulled so far from who I used to be. Later that week, I visited the local library and found a shelf of community history binders, old newspaper clippings, photos, even a few student essays from long ago about the lake and its surroundings. There, wedged in the middle of a yellowing page, was a picture of the cabin. Mine, before the renovations. The porch still had the original swing. The dock was smaller, but it was unmistakable. I made a copy and took it home. I taped it to my refrigerator. It sounds silly, but it gave me something solid to hold on to. Proof that I had existed there, that my presence had mattered. Desiree could sell property, Mitchell could host parties, Sylvia could smile for cameras. But I had been the one to plant trees, to dig the garden beds, to patch the roof. The cabin may no longer belong to me on paper, but I carried its truth in my bones, and no one could take that away. It was a Sunday morning when I drove past the lake for the first time in months. The sun hadn't fully risen, and the fog still clung to the surface of the water. For a second, I almost forgot what had happened. I almost let myself believe that nothing had changed, that I'd be pulling into my gravel driveway, hearing the soft crunch of tires as I parked near the porch. But the gate was locked. A new sign had been installed. Modern, flat lettering. The name of the new owners was printed across the bottom, along with a security company's logo. It looked cold, clinical. Nothing like the place I had once called home. I didn't linger. I parked off the road and walked along the trail that still cut behind the cabin. The section I had donated years ago hadn't changed much. The trees were taller now, the path a little more worn, but the air felt the same. Damp pine, moss, and something softer, like the memory of something good. As I walked, I saw the dock come into view through the trees. Not the main one, a smaller one we had built ourselves, years before Mitchell added the bigger one for his boat. It looked neglected now, the wood grey and splintered, but it was still there. I sat down at the edge and let my feet dangle over the water. I didn't cry. I didn't curse. I just breathed, deep and slow, letting the stillness surround me. That's when I heard laughter. It came from the main house. Through the trees I could make out figures on the porch, music, glasses clinking, another event, another gathering. Desiree's voice carried across the water. She was greeting guests. Her tone bright, performative. She used to speak like that in college when she was trying to impress professors. Now it had become her default setting, smooth, polished, untouchable. Sylvia stood beside her. She was wearing something expensive, her posture perfect. I watched for a minute, then turned away. It was strange, realizing they had filled the space with so much noise, yet I felt nothing. No envy, no anger, just distance, the kind that isn't measured in miles, but in understanding. Back in my car, I didn't head straight home. I drove to a quiet cafe on the other side of town. It was a place I used to visit with an old friend before she moved to Oregon. I ordered black coffee and sat by the window. The view wasn't much, just a parking lot and a faded mural. but it gave me room to think. I took out my notebook and started mapping out something that had been forming in my mind. A small storytelling project, local women, elders like me, sharing moments they thought no one remembered. Not for pity, for preservation. There was strength in stories, not the ones people told about us, but the ones we told ourselves, the ones we claimed back from silence. As I scribbled down ideas, the waitress refilled my cup and smiled. She didn't know who I was. She didn't know what I had lost. But in that moment, it didn't matter. I felt like a person again. Not a problem. Not an obstacle. Just Evelyn. And that was enough for now. I woke up that morning with a calm I hadn't felt in months. There was no sharp edge in my chest, no weight sitting behind my ribs. Just breath, steady and quiet. Maybe it was the walk by the lake or the coffee shop conversation with myself. Maybe it was finally naming what had happened. Or maybe I had stopped waiting for someone to say they were sorry. I spent the morning rearranging the furniture in my apartment. It wasn't much, just a modest one-bedroom in a quiet complex near the park. But it was mine. Every item in it had been placed by my own hands. No one had rearranged it while I was gone. No one had signed it away behind my back. That made all the difference. In the afternoon, I visited a nearby community centre. Marcy had mentioned they were hosting a weekend open house for local initiatives. I had printed a few flyers about the storytelling project, not really expecting anything. I thought I might tack them onto a bulletin board and quietly leave, but people noticed. One of the organisers asked if I would be willing to speak, just for a few minutes. I hesitated. My voice hadn't carried in rooms like that for a long time. I had gotten used to silence, to being overlooked. But something inside me nudged forward, so I spoke. I didn't tell them about Desiree or the cabin. I didn't name names or share betrayals. I simply talked about the value of memory, about how much we lose when we assume elders have nothing left to say. I said the world needed stories from those who had lived long enough to see things change, and those who had felt the sting of being forgotten. When I finished, there was a pause. Then a few people clapped, not politely, genuinely. An older man with a cane approached me after, said he had a journal he hadn't opened since his wife passed, that maybe it was time. A woman named Lila, in her early 70s, asked if the group was only for women. I said no. She smiled and said she had a story about a lost cookbook and a stolen wedding ring. That night, I lay in bed and realized I had crossed some invisible line. I wasn't in hiding anymore. I wasn't waiting for closure from people who had no intention of giving it. I was building something, even if it was small, even if no one ever apologized. That same week, I received a letter in the mail, thick envelope, no return address. Inside was an invitation. Desiree and Mitchell were hosting a private ceremony, a vow renewal, on the deck of the lake house. Guest list enclosed. My name wasn't on it, but someone had forwarded it to me. No note, just the envelope. I placed it on my table and stared at it for a long time. I didn't feel anger, not even bitterness, just clarity. This was who they were now, people who erased what didn't fit their image, and I was no longer part of it. But I had found something else, a piece of myself that didn't need their approval. I folded the invitation and slid it into the back of my journal, not out of sentiment, but as a reminder of where I had been and how far I had come. The morning after I received the invitation, I sat at my small kitchen table, the one I had bought second-hand years ago when I moved into this apartment. The sun spilled through the blinds, warming the wood under my fingertips. I didn't touch the envelope again. I didn't need to. I had already decided what I would do, even if I hadn't admitted it out loud yet. Instead, I focused on something else. The community story circle was starting to take shape. A small room had been reserved at the library, and Marcy had confirmed she'd help facilitate the first session. We had a list of attendees, about 9 names, mostly women in their 60s and 70s, all of them carrying stories they thought had no place to land. I spent that afternoon printing the welcome packets. Nothing fancy, just a simple outline, a few prompts, and some encouraging words. I also packed my own journal, now marked with folded pages and faint underlines, my name written firmly on the inside cover. A quiet declaration. When Saturday came, I was nervous. Not the shaky kind, just the quiet kind that makes your breath feel tight. But the moment I walked into that room and saw the chairs set in a circle, something in me settled. They arrived one by one. Lila brought lemon cookies. Edgar wore a vintage tie that looked straight out of the 50s. A woman named June carried a stack of faded photographs wrapped in tissue paper. There was laughter, shyness, even a few tears. And it was all real. Honest in a way I hadn't experienced in a long time. I shared my own story, not the full version, just the part about feeling erased, about having something I built handed away like it was nothing. I didn't name Desiree or Mitchell, but the pain in my voice carried enough shape for them to understand. They listened. Then June spoke. Then Edgar. One by one, the room filled with memory. It was like breathing in fresh air after months underground. When I walked home that evening, I passed by a boutique window. A soft scarf in the display caught my eye. Forest green with copper stitching. I stood there longer than I expected, watching how it moved slightly under the ceiling fan's breeze. I went inside and bought it. Not because I needed it, but because I wanted to choose something just for me. Later that night, as I folded the scarf into my drawer, I caught sight of the invitation again. I pulled it out, set it on the table, and opened my laptop. Instead of writing to Desiree, I wrote to Marcy. I told her I wanted to expand the circle into a monthly event, include workshops, maybe even an exhibit. I could offer to teach a session on legacy planning, not the legal kind, the personal kind. How to leave behind a life that couldn't be rewritten or stolen. As I hit send, I realized something had shifted. I wasn't trying to get back what I had lost anymore. I was building something new, and this time, no one could sell it out from under me. The call came just after 8 on a Thursday evening. I had just finished reviewing the final draft of our monthly storytelling flyer when my phone buzzed on the counter. It was from a number I didn't recognize, but something in me knew to pick it up. It was Sylvia. Her voice was lower than I remembered. Slower. Like she had rehearsed every word but still wasn't sure she believed them. She said Desiree had been going through a difficult time, that Mitchell was under pressure at work, that the vow renewal had not gone as smoothly as they hoped. She didn't say sorry, not directly, but she did mention the cabin. She said it had been a complicated decision, that Desiree thought I would understand, in time, that it wasn't personal, just practical, just a piece of property. I sat on the edge of my bed, listening to that word echo in my head. Just property. Sylvia paused, then asked if I'd be willing to meet for lunch. She said she had something she wanted to return. Her voice caught slightly on the word return, like it weighed more than it should. I agreed, not out of curiosity, not for closure, but because I was ready to look her in the eye and feel nothing. We met at a quiet diner 2 days later. She arrived wearing a pale blue coat I had once admired. She looked tired, not aged, just worn, the way people look when they know they've crossed a line they can't uncross. She slid an envelope across the table. I didn't reach for it. I waited. She said she found some old letters in the cabin's safe. Letters I had written to my husband years ago. Ones I thought had been lost in the fire we had during our first winter there. Apparently they had been tucked away, sealed in a weatherproof pouch I didn't even know he had used. She said Desiree was planning to throw them out, thought they were just scrap paper, but Sylvia had opened one and kept them. There was no apology in her tone, just explanation. I took the envelope. It was heavier than I expected. She reached for her coffee but didn't drink. Then, softly, she said something I hadn't braced for. She said she missed me. I didn't respond. I didn't smile or nod. I simply stood, thanked her for the letters, and walked out. The air outside was sharp, cold enough to pull you back into yourself. I held the envelope against my chest and kept walking. At home, I opened the letters slowly, one by one. The ink had faded in places. My handwriting was uneven, sometimes rushed, sometimes careful. Each word brought back pieces I had forgotten. Mornings by the lake, the sound of his laugh when the heater broke, the time we made soup from what we had left in the pantry and still called it a feast. I read them all in one sitting. When I finished, I didn't cry. I felt something steadier, like grounding, like gravity. I knew what I needed to do next. Not for revenge, not to prove a point, but to mark a boundary. The next morning, I reached out to the lawyer who had helped me with my apartment lease. I asked about creating a trust. Something small, something focused. By the afternoon, I had the name for it. The Cedar Table Fund, a place for women over 60 who had been displaced, erased, sold out, women who needed a place to sit and be heard. And this time, the deed would carry only my name. That morning, I ironed my best slate grey blouse and laid out the envelope from the attorney's office beside it. The apartment was quiet. I could hear the low hum of the radiator and the distant sound of someone dragging a trash bin across the parking lot. I moved slowly, but each step carried intention. The restaurant I chose wasn't glamorous. It was the same one where Mitchell used to take me when Desiree was pregnant with Eli. A small diner on the east side, where the booths still had cracked red vinyl, and the servers called everyone sweetheart. I had made a reservation under my name. Just one word: Patricia. I arrived early. The hostess gave me a warm nod and offered me a corner booth. I sat with my back to the wall, facing the entrance. I wanted to see their faces as they walked in. I didn't fidget. I didn't look around. I waited, hands folded, just like I used to when I was a mother trying to teach patience. Mitchell arrived first. He looked thinner than I remembered, stretched tight. His eyes scanned the room until they landed on me. For a moment he hesitated. Then he came over, sat without speaking. Desiree followed 2 minutes later, adjusting her coat, expression unreadable. She didn't greet me. I waited until the server brought water, then pulled the envelope from my bag and placed it on the table between us. They both looked at it. Mitchell reached for it first, but I placed my hand gently on top of his. I told them I hadn't come for reconciliation. I hadn't come to ask for explanations or apologies. I told them I had simply come to inform. The Cedar Table Fund was officially registered. The papers in that envelope detailed its purpose, its funding, and its irrevocable status. I explained that I had taken the proceeds from the silent sale of the cabin, the one they executed behind my back, and reinvested it. Through research, community partnerships, and strategic allocation, I had turned what was meant to erase me into something that would outlast them. Desiree's mouth tightened. Mitchell leaned back, eyes narrowed. Neither spoke. I continued. The fund would support women over 60 who had been forcibly removed from their homes by family. It would offer emergency housing, legal assistance, and workshops on financial literacy. The first location would be named after my late husband. The second would bear my own middle name, not theirs. They didn't ask for clarification. They knew what this meant. I stood up then. My part was done. As I reached for my coat, Mitchell finally spoke. He asked if this was my way of punishing them. I paused at that, not from hesitation, but from the weight of what I wanted to say. I told him this was not punishment. This was preservation. I walked out into the cold with the kind of stillness that doesn't come from anger, but from knowing that you no longer owe anyone a version of yourself they can manipulate. That night, I lit a candle in the small alcove of my apartment and wrote a new journal entry. I titled it The Quiet Victory, and I slept better than I had in years. That winter, I started walking every morning before sunrise. There was something calming about the stillness, the way the sidewalks stayed empty, and the streetlights painted long shadows across the snow. I didn't walk for exercise. I walked because the world felt quiet enough to think without interruption. Each morning, I'd pass the small office where the Cedar Table Fund was housed. Just a converted corner unit behind the bakery, but to me, it held more than brick and glass. It was the first space in years that felt like mine. Inside, the walls were painted a soft sage green. We kept a pot of coffee going all day. No buzzwords or mission statements on the wall, just a corkboard with handwritten notes from women who had come through the program. Most of them never said much. They didn't have to. They just needed a seat, a safe pause. I hired 2 part-time staff members, both retired school nurses, women who knew how to listen without fixing. One of them, Lenora, liked to bring in fresh muffins on Mondays. The other, Mavis, clipped articles from local papers about elder housing laws and pinned them above the desk. Every day we met someone new, a woman who had been staying in her car behind the gas station, another who had signed her house over to her son and was now sleeping in a church basement. One had lived with her daughter's family until they decided to turn her bedroom into a home gym. They arrived carrying plastic grocery bags and duffel bags, sometimes just a purse. But they all carried the same thing in their eyes. That stunned silence you wear when the people you raised act like you're a burden. We never asked for the full story on day one, just their name, whether they wanted tea or coffee, and if they needed to sleep. That was enough to start. One woman, Rosalie, had been a librarian for 30 years. Her husband passed, and 6 months later, her daughter told her they needed space. Rosalie ended up in a weekly motel until her pension cleared. By the time she came to us, she couldn't meet her own gaze in the mirror. She sat in our lounge for nearly 4 days before saying a word. When she finally did, it was to ask if the clock on the wall had always ticked that loud. That moment stayed with me. The details never shocked me anymore. What stayed with me were the small things, the way they folded napkins into precise triangles, the way they offered to help clean even when they had nowhere to go, the way they apologized for crying. The world had taught them that their worth ended when their usefulness ran out. But the fund wasn't built to rescue, it was built to remind. One Thursday afternoon, we hosted our first community circle. No agenda, just women sitting around with their tea, sharing whatever they felt like. Some didn't speak. Others talked about old recipes or how they used to hang their laundry in the summer. At the end, I read aloud one of my old letters from the cabin, one I had written to my husband after our first snowfall there. No one clapped, no one needed to. After they left, I stayed behind to lock up. I stood in the doorway and looked around at the room we had made. The soft light, the worn couch, the warmth that had nothing to do with the thermostat. It was small. It wasn't perfect. But it was a kind of home. and I had built it from the ashes of everything they tried to take. That morning, a small envelope arrived in my mailbox. No return address, no handwriting, just my name typed neatly in the center. I carried it back upstairs, placed it on the kitchen table, and stared at it for a while. I had a feeling what it was. Not dread, just a quiet bracing. Inside was an invitation. Desiree's mother was hosting a retirement dinner for herself, a formal gathering on the same yacht they had used for that birthday party. It included Mitchell and Desiree's names in the RSVP section. I traced the gold foil print with my thumb and let out a short, tired breath. It wasn't the invitation that stung, it was the silence before it. The fact that once again, they hadn't spoken to me directly. This wasn't about closure, it was a performance, a display, and I had no interest in attending another act in their play. I walked over to the closet, pulled out a small box tucked behind my coats. It held my husband's watch, a worn photograph of the cabin porch, and a sealed letter I had written a year ago, but never sent. I opened it and read it quietly to myself. It was addressed to Mitchell. In it, I had written about the smell of cedar and pine sap in early spring, about the mornings when he was 10, fishing quietly with his father, not yet old enough to know the weight of grown-up choices. I wrote about love, and how it can harden into control when we confuse proximity with connection. That letter reminded me why I started the fund, why I rebuilt my life piece by piece, not to retaliate but to recover. I placed the invitation in the box next to the letter and closed the lid. Later that afternoon, I met Lenora and Mavis at the community centre. We were setting up for our new winter housing initiative. Foldable cots, warm blankets, little welcome bags with socks and cocoa. There was a small line forming at the door. One woman had frost on her coat sleeves. Another had her belongings in a suitcase with a broken wheel. We didn't have speeches or clipboards, just soft voices and open hands. One of the newer volunteers, a college student, asked me how I kept going, how I didn't let anger shape everything I did. I told her that I used to carry anger like a second spine, stiff, rigid, always ready to hold me upright. But over time, I realized it made me unmovable, so I let it soften, not disappear, but shift. That night, I stood in the hallway of the shelter and watched two women laugh over a jigsaw puzzle, their voices low, but filled with something that sounded like the beginning of safety. Back at home, I made tea, sat at my kitchen table, and began writing a letter to Rosalie, the former librarian who now ran weekly reading sessions in our lounge. I told her about the invitation, and how proud I was that I had no desire to attend. I had built something real, something mine, and there was not a yacht on this earth that could carry me back to who I used to be. That spring, the lake thawed early. I drove up alone, winding through the familiar back roads, passing the same crooked fence post that marked the turnoff I had known for decades. The air smelled of pine needles and wet earth. I hadn't been back here since the day they told me it was gone. But now, it wasn't theirs to take anymore. It had taken 9 months of legal work, a retired judge's recommendation, and one quiet conversation with the new buyers, who had purchased the place unaware of the betrayal behind its sale. After learning the truth, they agreed to a lease-to-buy transfer. The cabin wasn't mine on paper just yet, but it was back in my hands in every way that mattered. I stepped onto the porch and ran my hand along the wooden railing, the one Mitchell and his father built the summer before his high school graduation. It had been freshly sanded, but the grooves from old nails still whispered their history. I unlocked the door, walked inside, and stood in silence. Nothing flashy, just the creak of the old floorboards, the faint scent of cedar, the kitchen counter where my husband used to cut apples. The sofa where I had read books with Mitchell when he was small, before all the noise and rolls and pride got in the way. I unpacked a small bag, just enough for a few days. Then I lit the fireplace, made a pot of coffee, and sat down in the same chair I always did, facing the water. There were still patches of ice floating far out near the middle. The wind blew steady and low. Later that evening, I wrote a short letter. Not to send, just to write. I told Mitchell I wasn't angry anymore. I told him I understood now that sometimes people cling to what makes them feel important, even if it costs them someone who once loved them without condition. I wrote that I hoped, someday, he would look in the mirror and see the boy who used to skip rocks on this lake, not the man who had forgotten how to listen. Then I folded the letter, placed it in the drawer by the window, and left it there. Some things don't need to be mailed. When I left the next morning, I locked the cabin and placed the key in my coat pocket. I wasn't sure when I would return, but I knew one thing for certain. This place wasn't a memory anymore. It was mine again. Not because of ownership or deeds or contracts, but because I chose not to let bitterness own me. If you've ever felt like your voice didn't matter, like you were erased from a story you helped build, I hope this gave you something to hold on to. Sometimes healing doesn't come from fighting to be seen. Sometimes it comes from seeing yourself again, on your own terms. If this story touched you, share your thoughts. You're not alone in the silence.